Oh, there's a nice rainbow. Pretty color on this one. I think this is a male. That's a beautiful rainbow. About a 5-6 pound fish. That's a beauty. Put her right in there and let her go. There you go. What a thrill. Hi, I'm Denny Rickards, and I want to welcome you to Advanced Strategies of Stillwater Fly Fishing. We're here on the BarzX Ranch at the base of the Colorado Rockies, and it's a late September day, but absolutely gorgeous. You know, folks, when we did our first video, we did it on the fundamentals of fly fishing still waters, and hopefully it was helpful for a lot of you guys. But what we want to do in this video this afternoon, the next day or two, and maybe some days on down the road, we want to show you some of the advanced techniques that I've learned on lakes. And primarily we want to get into a lake structure, break it down into zones so you understand what flies, what patterns, lines, retrieves, all that stuff that you're going to need to be successful. We're going to talk about the things that I see guys that either wade or fish out of a float tube pontoon boat when they do things wrong. We're going to talk about the relationship between the fly, the leader, the line, and the retrieve, which is so important on lakes. And we'll top it off with patterns, things that everybody wants to know, what flies to use on lakes. And we'll sum it up with the most common mistakes that I see guys making on lakes in general. So bear with us. I think you're going to find this informative, entertaining, and it'll be very enlightening for you. Folks, when you fish lakes, I think probably one of the easiest things to do is to break the lake down into 3 different zones. And those zones should be the top zone that can extend maybe just a couple of inches all the way down to maybe 3 or 4 feet. You've got the bottom zone that for the most part is about 2 or 3 feet. And the biggest zone of all is that middle zone that can be anywhere from 4 to as much as 20 or 30 feet. But there's only 2 of those zones that stillwater fly fishermen need to really concentrate on when fish feed, and that's that top zone and the bottom zone. To do that, what we want to talk about right now is the different lines and patterns that you're going to use and retrieves to effectively fish those zones. All right, folks, when you fish that top zone in any lake, you got to consider what food sources are found in that upper zone. And for me, I use these patterns to imitate those different food sources. So I like to use a lot of these calabatus nymphs like this, just in different colors, and I fish that up very close to the surface all the way down to as much as 2 or 3 feet. Midge larva, I'm going to show you how I fish this fly, which is totally different than a lot of other people fish it, as well as my AP emerger, which I find absolutely deadly. These are basically the same patterns, they're just different colors and sizes, and this is probably the most inappropriately named fly that I use. And this calabatus nymph is really, with a shell back, looks an awful lot like a scud. And if I do this in olive, and I have some that I use on a peacock that I call a peacock calabatus, I find it deadly whenever I see fish working near the surface. This is just a super fly for me, and here's a tip for you guys to remember. When I'm on a lake where I know there's brown trout and they come up in that evening when the wind starts to lay down, it gets calm and they start taking insects, this guy rarely, and I mean rarely, in 15 years that I've been fishing this pattern, ever fails me. I use a hand twist retrieve. I'm going to sight fish him. I'm going to put that fly right where I think that fish is going and put it up there, and I won't get more than a foot or 2, if that far, and he'll eat this thing. But I have to tie this fly in different colors to make it effective. I have it in dark olive. I'll have it in a peacock olive or a light colored back. This gray one like this, a black one, a cinnamon one. All of these are effective variations of the calabatus. And I'll tell you another thing about that fly. Even though I call it a calabatus nymph, it imitates a lot of different things depending on how I work it. Wow. Now if I see fish working up on top, another deadly, deadly fly for me is my AP emerger. And this little guy right here, I like it in a size 10, although I tie it in a 12 as well as a 10. But this fly, being an emerger pattern, That's what I designed it for. And so again, I'm going to use the clear intermediate or a colored intermediate, either one. I'm going to fish in the top foot or so, sometimes the top 6 inches, sometimes the top inch. And I may have to retrieve that very fast with a hand twist retrieve, or I may do it slow. But here's what's interesting about this fly. If I let it sink or I fish it on the bottom in shallow water, it looks a lot like, if I do it in an olive color, it looks a lot like a damsel nymph. And it also looks a lot like a water boatman. And if I get it wet and fish it right in around the rocks and debris, it can be taken for a scud. So it can imitate a lot of different things. So I tie this one in black, olive, cinnamon, and gray. Okay, there's another key fly for me. Now, up until last year, I wasn't really a very good midge fisherman. I'll tell you that right now, because I didn't have the patience to do it. But I found that this fly right here, this midge larva, and I tie it in black, I'll tie it in a blood midge color, and I'll tie it in an olive. But this black one with copper wire in here, it's a simple fly to tie. It really represents, because of the seal's fur up here at the head, it represents for me the in-between stage between the larva, which is really what it looks like, but I'll fish it up in the surface film, up on top with a very quick hand twist retrieve to keep it in that zone. And you know what I think the fish are taking this thing for? Is the transformation stage between the larva and the pupa. And if you guys ever check the stomach contents in a lot of these trout you're catching, and they're eating midges, you'll know that this guy right here is a dead ringer for a lot of that pupa. And that's really the stage that the trout like so well. And they don't eat the pupas down, they eat them right there in that subsurface area. If I want to fish it as a larva, I've got to put it down. Here's something, and I know you guys that are really good at chronomids, that I had to learn the hard way. When the trout take that blood midge, they usually take it down deep when it's a little bit colder and earlier in the year. But that can be any time during the year. But as they move up to the water table, I find that the black one far outfishes a blood midge if I fish it subsurface or even the olive. So the key here is to hand twist, sometimes very quickly. If I want to fish it deep, then I'll do a slow hand twist and get it down deeper. But that blood midge or this midge larva right here will save my bacon on a lot of different days. But those are my bread and butter flies that I use in that upper zone. Along with that, when I see the damsels coming off, I'll use these damsel nymphs. Everything on this side with a black head is weighted. Everything over here is unweighted. But I have a little different color variations for different lakes, different habitats. And this stillwater nymph, for me, is a basic damsel imitation. But because it's got this orange colored hackle underneath, and I even put a little orange in the tail to dress this one up a little bit too, with olive over the back, this particular fly is going to imitate a damsel nymph, or it can be a scud if I fish it deep. If I'm fishing as a damsel nymph, here's the key thing to remember. Trout take damsel nymphs just a few inches below the surface. So what line would you use? Either a floating line or the intermediate. That's the line you want to use with this fly. And to make this fly look and act like a damsel, I'm going to do a slow hand twist retrieve with this pattern. If you have a damsel nymph that you like, that's the retrieve that you should be using, and you should be fishing it in that top 5, 6, 7 inches. Can you go deeper with it? Yes, you can. And I'm going to show you later on during this tape, we're going to fish some lakes, and I'm going to put this fly on, and if they're not hitting and I don't see any surface activity, and I know there's no damsels this time of year, I'm still going to use it, and I'm going to go down a little deeper. Why? Because of its suggestive nature. That soft tail, it imitates a lot of living creatures that these fish might take it for. So just because I call it a stillwater nymph, which is damsel imitation, don't you make the mistake, and I'm not going to make the mistake of always assuming that's what the fish take it for. Nice fish though. Pretty fish. All right, folks, for that middle or bottom zone, I use mostly the bugger, leech, minnow type imitations, and that's what I keep in this box. This is a fly that I use for probing lakes no matter where I go. This is my seal bugger, and I do this in 12 variations of colors. This orange tail here, dark olive body, and a burnt orange hackle in there. This is a dynamite fly for me. I search with it. I find it very effective. I'll use this pattern early in the season, late in the season, early in the day, and late in the day. And on lakes that I don't know what's going on yet and I have to get familiar with, this is a good searching pattern for me. But just remember, it basically imitates a leech or a dragonfly nymph. We can imitate fish with it, but you guys will find out if you weight it at the head like I've done here with 20 wraps of O2O wire, this fly will drop down, and as I pull on my retrieve, it'll come back up. So every time you pull and put the pause in that retrieve, the fly's going to drop. And as you pull it again, it comes back up. And we get that undulating type movement. And trout have a hard time refusing that. they may take it very well from about 6 in the morning till about 8 in the morning, then they'll quit. Because aquatic insects will start to emerge, and then you have to switch to smaller stuff, and as the sun goes back down, gets low in the sky, they'll come back on this thing. So you guys want to be able to use that, and you can see right here in this fly box, I've got a lot of variations of these seal bugger colors. So that's a good thing to have with you, and the reason we do different color combinations, I like the darker colors early and late in the day when it's real dark. I like the brighter colors like this midday when we got a lot of sunshine. Here's one tip that you can take to the bank. If you don't see those fish working up on top, then they're down. They'll be in one of the two places, but when they feed, remember, they're going to come up near that surface, or they may be in shallow water on the bottom feeding. So this is a fly that I'm going to use, and I'm going to show you the retrieves that I use for it in just a second. But key thing to remember, you can use your bead heads and other patterns, but if you're going to put them on the bottom, trout are less selective. They're far more opportunistic feeders when they're feeding near the bottom, as opposed to higher they come, then they become a lot more selective as to what they're going to eat. And if they're feeding in a zone and they aren't too picky, you can use a lot of patterns. Again, it's not the pattern you use, it's not even the retrieve you use a lot of times. It's the line you use that holds you in that zone longest. That's really your key to lakes. Now the last pattern I want to cover with you, and this is one where I don't find a lot of fly fishermen today using, has to do with our streamers. And the streamers, you guys, when I'm talking about advanced techniques, this is not an advanced technique fly. This little fly right here is a good imitation of either a chub minnow or a shiner minnow, or a lot of minnows that trout find in the water. I've found in fishing over the years, I used to use great big minnow imitations. You can do that, but you know what I found? I'm coming down smaller and smaller and smaller. This is a size 8, and I rarely use it bigger than an 8. 10, just as well, because if you look at a lot of the minnows, and that's the key thing for you guys to remember when you use a streamer imitation, just match up with the size of the minnows that are in that particular lake. And let me show you the retrieve I like to use with the streamer patterns. If I'm out there retrieving that fly, I want to take that thing and I'm going to use kind of a jerky type pull like this to imitate a small bait fish moving through the water. With the bugger type flies, I'll use basically 2 different speeds on it. It's mostly going to be a long pull, maybe 1 foot to 1.5 foot. Sometimes I'll pull real slow like this. Other times I'll give it more of a jerky type pull. But those are some of the tips to think about when you're choosing patterns. Whatever fly you guys use, here's a final tip for you to remember. If you don't think it looks right and you don't have confidence in it, then don't even waste the time to tie it on, because you won't stay with it very long. So think about your patterns, think about what you want to imitate, especially the retrieve that'll match up, and I know you're going to be successful. This is one of the many brook trout beaver pond lakes here on the ranch, and I'm using a little calabatus nymph, peacock calabatus. Guys, remember when you're working over brook trout, they're structure huggers, just like the browns, and they like to lay deeper out in that water. So we need to work these edges, and if we don't find them coming up, then we got to go down to them. They normally like dark flies on jerky pulls down deep. We'll see if we can't entice one of these guys up to take this fly, but if not, then we'll go down to him. There he is. There's a good one. Boy, they're laying right down in that bottom too. This guy's got some body to him. Looks like a male. And it is. There's a nice brook trout. That's a nice male brookie. Gonna get this out of here. That's a pretty fish. There you go, young fella. One final thing to keep in mind, folks, when you're fishing the different zones, take into account the weather factors that you have at the time. In other words, if it's early season, you know the water's going to be colder, so the fish should be a little bit deeper. And if you're going to fish that deeper zone, for me, that's usually 5-6 feet, but it could be as much as 10 or 15 feet, but I don't like to go much beyond 10. But early in the season, I'm not going to use aquatic insect patterns because aquatic insects aren't in the water. So I'm going to use more of a leech or a seal bugger type fly, and I'm going to fish in deeper, and I'm going to go slower. If you've got a windy condition and the water's all rippled up, I'll probably fish a little bit deeper in that zone, but up near the surface. But bottom line to this part is just remember that the weather, the time of the day, all the factors that you find in the water are going to dictate what you need to do. So if you're not on top, you know they're down. Folks, when we go to a lake for the first time, people ask me all the time, how do I know what pattern I'm going to use, what line I want to use, what retrieve? I think one of the most common mistakes a lot of us make is we fail to match up the line, the pattern, and retrieve, and they have to match, and here's what I mean by that. For me, if I'm fishing an intermediate line, I'm going to fish that intermediate line in very shallow water. But that also is going to dictate what patterns I can use and what retrieves. If you want to look at it the other way around, what's the deadliest fly that you guys like to use when you go to a lake? If you don't know what that fly imitates, how do you know what speed to pull it, what depth to fish it, or what angle it should pass through the water? So those are the key factors to keep in mind. When you tie that fly on, have some idea what it is that you're trying to imitate in the water. For example, if I'm going to fish deep on a particular lake and I'm going to use my type 2 line to get me down in that zone, what insects are found on the bottom? For me, I know there's snails down there, there's scuds down there, dragonfly nymphs are down there, and those are primarily what we find in a lot of lakes near the bottom area. If you're in shallow water, you might find a whole bunch of other things, but with those type of insects, I'm going to fish down deep. I know that most of those things don't move real fast, so that tells me I'm going to have to use a slow retrieve with a fly that will imitate one of those food sources, and I need a fly line that'll get me down. What we see a lot of times is guys using floating lines with bugger type flies that really imitate things, a lot of times leeches or dragonfly nymphs, that are found down deep. So you guys just think about when you're tying that fly on, if you're going to use a little aquatic insect or a terrestrial and you're going to fish it subsurface like an emerger, if it's a mayfly or a caddisfly or a dragon or a damselfly, maybe a midge, these type of food sources that trout look for when they eat them are eaten mostly in that subsurface area, and a trout will pick a particular stage of that insect to feed on. That insect may be just a couple inches below, he could be 2 or 3 feet below. He could be right in that surface film. So if you're going to fish that zone, you need the intermediate. It usually means in a hand twist retrieve or a short pull and pause, something like this where you're pulling real slow, and you fish that upper zone. So you have to match up whatever you're doing with the pattern that you're using. Now, if you don't find anything going on and you pick a fly and you wonder, God, should I fish it on top or should I fish it on the bottom? There are some flies that you can work from the top to the bottom. And it just happens to be, for me, that's a seal bugger. I can use a seal bugger, but I primarily use that fly early and late in the season, early and late in the day, anytime during the season. And the lake that I fish will dictate a lot whether I use that fly now or I want to use it later on in the day, whatever it might be. If it's a summertime condition and I don't see a lot of surface activity going on in the lake, and I know the food sources in that lake are minimal, in other words, there's leeches in all lakes, but there aren't a lot of dragonfly nymphs in that lake, but there's lots of snails or things like that. I'm going to use a fly that I want to get it down deep, whether it's the bugger or something else, but I'm going to have to move it slow. So all I'm trying to get across at this point is for you guys to stop and think about when you tie that fly on, what are you trying to imitate with it? Think about the retrieve and make sure that they match. The line, the pattern, and the retrieve should always match. If you fish it up, hand twist them. Short pulls and pauses and fish in that top 2 inches, 2-3 feet. If you're going to fish them down, then use the bugger, or I don't think we really do a good job in imitating a snail to begin with. You don't have, and I don't have the patience to sit there and fish a fly as slow as a snail can move. And if a trout takes it, just remember this, and I found this out a long time ago, when you're talking pattern selection, folks, don't ever assume that that fish is taking that fly for what you call it for. You'll find that if you're fishing that upper zone, the key is being in that zone, and they'll take a lot of different flies. Even though they may be taking caddis, sometimes they'll take a mayfly nymph or a damsel nymph because it's in the zone. And when you fish deep, as I mentioned earlier, you guys just remember, trout are less selective when they go down and feed deep. They're more opportunistic. So we can get by with fewer flies, move them slower, and if the trout sees it, he'll probably pick it up. Now with that thought in mind, let's talk about, because there's just a ton of confusion out there in the fly fishing world, what is an intermediate? I keep referring to it. I tell you what the sink rate is, but you know, there are so many things, and the manufacturers have contributed to this to some degree, a lot of confusion as to what an intermediate is. An intermediate, in its very bottom sense, folks, is the slowest full sinking line that's made. That means it goes down slower. When we numbered lines, we numbered them 1 through 5, 1 being a slow sink, 5 being a very fast sink. Well, when they came up with the intermediate, what are you going to call it? Because it sinks slower than a 1. It sounds like a term that it belongs somewhere in the middle, but it's used, the line was basically used, first of all, to fish for bonefish in the saltwater, and we've made a freshwater version because it does such a great job on lakes. It's not a line for rivers and streams, but I know guys that'll even use it over there. But an intermediate, definition-wise, means it's the slowest full sinking line. That means it doesn't sink faster than a 1 or a 2. A 1 goes down slow, 2 is a little faster, 3 is a little faster, right on down to a 5, which sinks very fast. Now, when you think about the intermediate and you look at the different labels that you see on boxes, it should say, and Scientific Angler is the only one that really tells you, it says slowest on its sink rate. The rest of the lines, I know that there's a lot of variation out there. I see guys coming to some of my clinics and guide trips, and they have all kinds of junk that guys have sold them that really doesn't match what the conditions are. So when you're thinking intermediate, make sure it says it on the box, okay? That's what it means. Your faster sinking lines, it should tell you sink rate. And an intermediate sinks about 1 to 1 1/4 inches per second. But you'll notice, like Scientific Angler says on their box, that their intermediate sinks from 1 1/4 to 1 3/4. Why the variation? Because the density in your heavier lines, like a 6 or a 7 weight line, is going to sink faster than a 4 or 5 weight. So that's why there's a little variation there on sink rate. So if you guys like to go real light and you're using a 4 weight or a 5 weight line, it's going to sink slower than a 7 weight. Both of them are intermediates. But stop again and think about the conditions you're going to fish under. But I think it's important that you understand that an intermediate means slowest full sinking line, and only one line can be that way. Now, folks, there's one other thing we have to consider. Just in the last 4, 5, 6 years, Scientific Anglers made the first breakthrough on the clear lines, and that's what we're talking about here, where there's no color. And when you look at a colored line versus a clear line, when do you need each one? A colored line, for me, and when I can use a colored line if I wanted to, I've done it for 30 years, but when I use a colored line, it means that I've got some kind, or the trout have some kind of cover in place. So what's cover? Cover for trout, if you saw the first video that I did, means that there's either ripple on the water, or it's early and late in the day before the sun gets up, or there's algae conditions, rain, anything that distorts their vision where they can't see you, you can't see them. That's a time you can get by with a colored line. The deeper you go in the water, you can use colored lines. The one time that this clear line is the clear choice for you when you fish a lake is when the lake goes real flat. You get a high sun like we've got right now, you can't false cast and put that line over fish without spooking them. You're going to move them. And if you don't think that's true, you wait and see how many grabs you get when that fly hits. There's no margin for error. But I find that when I'm using these clear lines like this, and you know, this clear line right here happens to be made by Cortland. We talked about it earlier. It's their camo line. It is far and away the smoothest casting line I've ever used on a lake, and that's as of right now. We don't know what they're going to come up with in the future, but this line to me is a cat's meow because it sinks very slow, it's clear, it handles well, it casts well, and when I put my leader on this, I'm going to use a 12-footer. There's got a lot of good leaders out there, but don't skimp there. Get yourself a quality leader. Now, with this clear line, what it means is that you guys can go out and false cast over fish. They might dart for a second when it hits the water, but we'll prove to you when you see some underwater shots we're going to do, this line is harder to detect than a colored line because it doesn't reflect any light, so you don't spook fish. But if you've got the colored intermediates, go ahead and fish them. They'll work just fine for you. They have for me for 30 years. And when it comes to the condition where it gets clear, just remember, if you're going to use your colored line, you're going to have to extend that leader on out there so we're not going to spook fish when we're casting over them, okay? When we think about that, we have to think in terms of leaders and tippets that go along with these lines. Now here's what I use that works very successful for me. If you guys have got colored lines and you're going to put a leader on it, I would say 12 feet is the bare minimum that I would use in that situation. And what you have to think about, as your fly sinks deeper, you won't need as long a leader, but I'm not going to change it because I know I'm going to test a deeper zone. If I've got a 12-footer on and I know I've got a weighted fly to get down there, I'm going to leave that on there. Whether you use on your regular clear lines, leader length is no longer as critical as it is with a colored line. And I'll use basically a 12-foot leader. Why not a 9-foot leader, since I'm using 90-foot leader anyway? You'll find that when you cast, 9-foot leaders, folks, come down a little harder on the water. They go kind of kerplunk, splash a little bit. Even the best casters have a hard time landing a fly very softly on the water. And when fish are feeding up in that zone, there's no margin for error. So I use a 12-footer because it drops your fly softer on the water. And if you can turn over a 9, you can turn over a 12. When it comes down to tippet, that's what's going to attach to your fly. Remember, that's the part that the fish see. I don't know whether it's that critical at this point, and I don't think anybody else does either, whether we need to use full fluorocarbon leaders, but I do use the fluorocarbon tippet. And what I've done since I got back from New Zealand here last year, I've been using 3X with even size 12 flies, and I'm going to show you how to tie a knot here in just a minute. That'll make a lot of difference. And as long as we're on that subject, let's talk about fluorocarbon versus monofilament. Which is the better way to go? I can just tell you from experience that I've had guys in the boat that were using fluorocarbon right after it came out, and I was still using the monofilament leader. They're catching and I'm not. As soon as I switched, I started catching too. So I learned a long time ago there is a difference. And the product that I use, and I don't have any qualms in recommending these guys, this is mainstream. This is what they call their site-free product, and this stuff, it's fluorocarbon tippet, and because of it, fluorocarbon is not as strong as monofilament when you tie your knots, but I'm going to show you a knot in just a second that I use with this. One thing about the site-free material that I use, folks, in this fluorocarbon, you'll see that it says 6-pound test here, but remember, with this product, they tell you, because it's made in England, they tell you the minimum breaking strength. The maximum breaking strength is about 8 3/4 pounds, even though it says 6 pounds. So what they're saying is it won't break under that. Another thing about this product, they give you 50 meters, as opposed to a lot of the spools here sold in the United States are only 25. So you guys want to get your money's worth. I haven't found a better product than this, and I sell a lot of them, and you'll find that this is quality stuff. Now, let's talk about the knot, and I'm going to show you a knot that I learned in New Zealand last year. Mike Frith, a friend of mine up in Seattle, showed me this knot, and when it comes to knot strengths, you know, we can get into all kinds of things about knots and different things, but Ed Rice uses a very similar knot that he's taught me, and both of them are almost identical, but these knots are 100%. They don't have a breaking strength of 90% or 85%, they're 100%. So since I've gone to it, I break off very few fish, but here's a tip for you, and remember this. When you're using a clear line, and I go to 3X, that's about 8.5 pound test, and I know I'm going to be fishing over big fish. The key to it with this knot I'm going to show you is that it allows my fly to get free movement, free wiggle there as I'm pulling it through, and we all know that it's the movement of the fly that attracts your fish. So that's why I'm going to use this knot that I'm going to show you right now, and you'll see if you can learn to tie this, or there's knot books out there that show it's very similar to the Rapala knot or the Orvis knot, I think is what some people call it, but it's a loop knot and allows free movement, and with that I can use fluorocarbon where I used to use 4. I've gone down to 3X only because of this knot that I'm going to show you. So let's see how it's tied. Okay, to do this loop knot that we talked about, folks, the first thing we do is I'm going to do an overhand knot in the line. I know this might be tough for you to see, but we'll try to make it as easy as possible. In that overhand knot, leave a loop hole about that big around, and take the tag in with your fly and come up through the bottom of the fly. Then I'm going to hold the tag in between my thumb and index finger and bring the fly right down here to the circle. So I'm holding the circle and the fly between my thumb and index finger. Now with this tag in right here, I'm going to push it through this hole going away from me, like so. Now I'm going to use my teeth to pull this out. Grab that in. Now with the tag end, this is the rest of my leader, I'm going to go over the tippet here twice toward me. So here's once over, there's twice over. Now to finish the knot, I'm going to come back through the circle right here, coming toward me, which is the opposite direction I went through the first time. Now I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to pull this tight, and that loop that you saw becomes the knot. So I'm going to pull on this tag end as well as the leader at the same time, and I'm going to try to leave just a little bit of loop on the end. Let's see if we can do that where you can see it. I pulled it tight like that. Now if you look up here, let me cut the end off. Now you see what we've got here, folks, this little tiny loop right here. This is easy not to tie, but look how the fly can move and wiggle on the end. Now with this thing free to wiggle like this, it gives you free movement of this fly as it moves through the water. You've got 100% strength on your knot, and I'm using 3X with a little tiny fly. And that's the key for you, because with fluorocarbon, I can go up one size. Where I used to use 4X, now I can use 3. If the conditions call for 5X, I can use 4 by using this little loop knot. Easy to tie, and I'll tell you, I don't break off very many fish anymore. This is a toad. We'll have fun trying to land this without a net, I'll tell you. I don't know if we can even hold this fish. He's big. Just a little size 12 calibatus nymph. God, this is so much fun. Especially when you do it right and eat it. Maybe I just got lucky. There is a nice fish. That is a nice fish. Folks, when you get on lakes like this, kind of a late morning type situation, and before I got on the water here, I looked around and I didn't see a whole lot of fish working. So what I'm going to do, normally I'm going to stay with my camo intermediate here, and I could use either an AP or a calibatus or midge larva, and that's what I would prefer to use when I see fish working. But because I don't see a lot of fish working, I'm going to take this, what I call my stillwater nymph, and this fly, because it's very suggestive, even though it imitates a damsel, and I haven't seen a lot of damsels this morning, I want to keep it up and work my way down from the surface down. So I'm going to take that particular fly, use a little hand twist retrieve or a short pull and pause. We'll see which way they may like it. There's some nice browns and cutthroats and rainbows in this lake. We'll see if this guy will work it, and if it doesn't work for me, then I'll try another pattern. But this, because it's so suggestive, we're going to give that a try and see what happens. So let's get out and we'll see what happens with these guys. Okay, one of the key areas, folks, about fishing any lake is where you're going to put your fly. So for me, the thing I always look for are the most productive feeding areas. And as we've already talked about, I want to fish the shallow shoreline areas where I know trout are going to go to look for food. I may look for springs, for sudden, any inlet that's coming in, sudden drop-offs, weedy areas. Those are all prime areas to look for trout. If you're in a reservoir, learn where the old channels are, because they'll be a little deeper and some of the fish will hold down there. But just remember that if you're going to go in and you're going to fish those shallow areas, you need to be at the zone those fish are feeding. So if it's real shallow, in other words 3, 4, 5 feet down to maybe a foot, you can very effectively use your intermediate or floating line. But the main thing is to keep your fly in front of those fish where they're going to be feeding. Just remember this: the deadliest fly in the world is useless if the trout don't see it. So you want to concentrate on the areas that you know the fish will be feeding, and don't forget that time frame. Use the cover that Mother Nature provides, wind or early and late in the day when we have no sunlight on the water, even algae type water. Those are all good forms of cover to work your flies under. So I'm going to go on in here and I'm going to start working these shallow shoreline areas and see if there's any fish in there working and feeding. This is an unweighted stillwater nymph, the size 10. I think you'll find that a lot of patterns will work just keeping in that zone, but I like the way this one moves and breathes in the water, so we never can be sure what they're going to take it for. Now if I don't get hit here in the next few pulls on this line, I'm going to do a little countdown now. I'm going to count 10 before I start to pull. and we'll see if that makes a difference. I'll get down about a foot before I start to pull this. When I count, I use like 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004. So you approximately, by the time you get down to 10, you're about right. So we're down about a foot right now, so I'm going to start probing right across the top of that zone. You know, this time of year, this lake isn't deep enough to stratify, but that upper part of this lake, the surface temperature is colder, I think, than what we're going to find down about 5 or 6 feet. So warmer water may be down a little deeper now. There certainly isn't any insect life on the lake, so we have to start probing. And that's how you work these different depths on lakes where you guys aren't quite sure how deep to fish your flies. Just start on the top and work down. If you know for a fact that the water's warmer down and the lake's turned over, then you can take it and you can use a faster sinking line and start down a little bit deeper. But probably I'm fishing in depths here of about 6 to 8 feet in towards shore there. Obviously a bit a little shallower, but another thing, you guys, remember when you're fishing lakes like this, you want to move your casts around. You don't want to cast to the same spot twice unless you're sight fishing for a fish. So if you don't see the fish working, move your cast around and cover different spots out there. That way you cover the water a lot quicker, and then if you've done a general area and you haven't gotten hit, then it's time to move to another spot, and you keep probing along until you find where the fish are holding. This looks like a cutthroat, not a brown. This cold water's obviously taking its toll on them again, but pretty fish too. Nice fish though. Pretty fish. Okay, we're on one of these upper lakes here on Barziex Ranch. It's a rather large beaver pond, but it's got some really big browns and big brookies in it. And just a few minutes ago there were fish working near the surface here, but a ripple's come up and has kind of stopped the rise, but they're cruising out there just below the surface. So for me, I'm going to try a 10 calibrated snip. I'm going to use a little short pull and pause retrieve with this intermediate line. Move the thing around. I'm going to try to spot fish and sight them and see if we can get them to take this. This breeze will lay down in a minute, but anyway, you can see a couple of fish working right over in there. So I'm going to get on down there and see if we can't get something going right on these edges. You guys, just remember when you're wading a lake like I'm doing here, you got to be really cautious. Even though there's a ripple blowing into me that'll give me a little bit of cover, I know there's going to be fish right on these edges. There's one right in front of it that just moved that I didn't see. Got to be really careful now when we wade these edges, even with a little breeze blowing in here. I like to lay right on this left-hand edge up by this brush. So I'm going to work my way right up along this edge here. Fairly shallow water right on this edge, and it drops off to about 5-6 feet out there. Oh, there's one. I saw you, you little devil. That's about a 20-inch, maybe 4 or 5. No, about 3 to 4 maybe. Brown, nice fish. See if we can keep them away from putting those others down. Come on, quit that splashing. Okay. Some of the most common faults that we see anglers make when they're fishing lakes, folks, whether they're fishing from shore like we're doing now or they're out in a pontoon boat, is we tend to want to stay in one spot too long, and I think that's a big mistake, because what's going to happen is a lot of the fish that you're trying to catch out there, after you've caught one or two, the rest of them are kind of weary or they're on alert. They know that something's going on. Another thing is every time you pick that line up, and if you're not a good caster and it goes splash or plunk, or the fish is caught and he's jumping, he's hooking, and if you're in a boat, you're dropping an anchor, you're pulling it up and drop a can of soda pop, or you're pouring coffee, or all that noise, all these distractions, what's going to happen is those fish will tend to stay out away from you for a while. But even when you get into a spot where you're catching fish and you're doing a lot of things right, watch what happens to you. Pretty soon those fish that you're catching, you're going to find the bite ratio is going to slide back slower and slower, and you're going to get fewer and fewer hits. And it's not because that what you're doing is wrong necessarily. The fish have moved because of all the commotion that's going on. So the best thing to do in that instance is to keep moving. And when I find a spot, especially if I'm in a float tube and I'm casting in an area, I may go down as much as 100 yards. When I get to the other end, I'll kick back and come right back to where I started. And the reason for that is if I know it's a good spot and I was catching fish, I'll just rest it for a while and then come back. If you're fishing shore like we're doing right now, you have to probe. And to probe, you have to keep covering new areas. What it does is two things for you. One, you'll learn the water and you'll learn where those fish are holding. And the other thing it'll do, by covering more water, allows you to catch and show your fly to fish that they haven't seen your presentation yet. So in both instances, you'll find that you'll catch more fish doing that. If you're going to fish, and you're going to fish on lakes consistently, you're going to have to learn to make longer casts than what we do on streams and rivers. Another thing that you want to think about is that, and you get ready to put that line on the water, as soon as it comes down, pull that line tight right now, so it's tight so while the flies drop and you don't get surprised, because a lot of times these fish will take that fly on a drop. The other thing you have to do, and you got to do this consistently, is put that tip right down in the water. With that tip in the water, the line's tight. If he just comes up and sucks that fly in, you'll be able to feel it. If you get your rod up in this position, you see how the line slacks off the rod tip like that? That's slack I'm pulling in, folks. And when you look at fly fishing, there's three areas that you cannot have slack. You can't have it when you're casting, you have to cast a tight line. You can't have it when you're retrieving, you have to retrieve a tight line. And you can't have it once you've hooked that fish, allow slack to enter into the play once you've got him hooked. So those are three things that you have to do to allow you to be more consistent with a catch rate. A lot of people that fish patterns, either when they're tying them or they're buying, they've done it in an overdressed manner. I showed you the fly box earlier, but this is just an AP emerger here. When I take this fly out and show you, this is an AP emerger, and this is a pattern that's very consistent for me on lakes, but it's very sparse. It doesn't have a lot of tail to it. It's got a very small, sparse body and the hackle over the top. The partridge keeps this fly, when it gets wet, it looks very much like a living insect. And that's what I call a sparsely dressed fly. We tend to, like in our buggers, to put the tails too long. Even if I show you, this is kind of a version of a dragonfly nymph, but I put a marabou tail on it. When we get it wet, it's going to look very, very fine. There isn't going to be a whole lot to it, but a pattern like that will attract fish a lot more than if you have too bulky a body, too bulky a tail, or too much hackle on it. Keep them sparse. Remember, it's the movement, the motion that attracts fish when you're fishing flies in lakes. And with these kind of flies, I can consistently stay in fish no matter where I go. So when you think about patterns, just don't overdress them. Don't put more in there than you actually need, and try to keep it looking not so much to clone the insect, but to make it as suggestive as you can so it imitates not one thing, but several different things. In order for you to catch more fish, let me point out some of the things that I see folks doing wrong. One of the most important things that I see folks doing wrong is when you get a little bit of a breeze, and right now I'm getting a breeze from my left to my right. If I want to fish down in this area right here, and I make my cast, if there's a wind blowing from my back, I don't want to be sliding into my cast because the wind is to my back. You have to kick enough to keep your line tight out in front of you. And how you'll know that, if you look out at the end of your rod tip there, if that line starts to go straight down or buckles or coils at the end, then you know you're sliding into a cast. A little ripple like this isn't going to make a whole lot of difference. But if you're into a good heavy wind, you have to have that line tight. So remember, it's a bad thing to slide this way into your cast, because what's going to happen as you're retrieving your fly towards you, your line's actually dropping deeper in the water, and all your retrieving is doing is pulling in slack caused by the drift into it. So in order to stop that, I have to kick just tight enough so my line's tight. And if you look at the end of the rod tip out there, you'll see as long as this line is tight downwind, and I'm pulling like this, and I come back toward me, I'm getting a true retrieve, and just like that, see where the line was tight and the fish picked it up, and we've got a fish on only because I kicked hard enough to keep that line tight. And that's what you can do. But if you slide forward going into your cast, you're going to find that slack is going to cause your fly to drop quicker in the water, and you're not going to be able to hold on to that fish. So by keeping your line tight, as we did right there, these fish will come up, and when you pull the fly toward you, you're getting a true retrieve. Otherwise, as you slide down, the fly, as I said, will drop deeper, and you won't get a true retrieve, and you're going to get a lot of poor presentation because of it. But by keeping that line tight, you can feel what's going on with your fly. The fish will know it. It's going to act more realistic for you, and they'll respond for you. Fish like this are common in these high country lakes. Some of them, of course, have got bigger trout in them, but you take a rainbow like this, and this is a healthy size rainbow, but you can see that's what'll happen when you guys make a good presentation. If you guys are out on a lake and you want to troll, you want to kick and get from point A to point B, just remember what I see a lot of guys doing is if the shoreline were over here, I don't want to be moving the same direction that fish move. So if I'm in fairly close and shallow water, this is not a good idea. You'll find it better if you turn yourself around. If you're going to do it right, make your cast into shore as you're moving, like so. If the wind's blowing from my left to my right, let it move you down. And as you're making your retrieve, coming back like this, you can stay in that zone very easy. But the whole point is that as I'm going down there, because trout move parallel to a shoreline, you're showing them profile, the head and the tail of your fly as you move down. So I can cover that zone. If I like this particular spot and I don't get hit, I'll bring the fly up. I don't have to bring it all the way back in. I'll kick down a ways like this, turn around when I see another good looking spot. Get ready, put your cast down on the water, pull your line tight right away, and begin your retrieve. If you want to sink it a little deeper, even though it might be shallow, count 5, count 10, and then start your retrieve. But remember, keep your rod tip right at the water, strip it very slowly, and work that fly like you would as though you know that fish is there and he's going to take it. So what I'm going to try to do is when I'm doing that, I'll cast down along the shoreline, kick back just enough to get my line tight, and if they're cruising that way, there he is. Just put your fly out there, you got your fish hooked, and this isn't too tough. But it's a common mistake that I see guys make is trying to move parallel and keeping your fly going the same direction that the fish are going. We don't want to have that happen. So always remember, it's more effective. I think you'll find it more productive for you if you cast in along the shoreline rather than parallel trolling, that sort of thing. You can still get down to the point you're going to, but if you've got decent water to cover there, why not fish it on down and make good use of your time there. Get him, slide him across the top there and bring him right on in. But that's a key example of what I'm referring to when we're talking about fishing a shoreline and casting into it. You want to be moving, you don't want to be moving the same direction that those fish are moving, because it won't be nearly as effective for you if you do that. Now another thing that I see folks make mistakes in when they're in a pontoon boat or a belly boat or whatever is we tend at times to get too far out into the middle of the lake. And if that's our shoreline area, you got to remember, as we talked about earlier, how a zone and a lake is set up. You guys keep your flies in that shallow water zone. And if I'm kicking out and I'm starting to get in that 10, 12, 14 foot of water, I'm getting over fish for the most part that are not actively feeding. Just remember, the most productive zones on any lake are going to be right in there along that shoreline, not out here in the deeper water. So you're going to have to weigh that. Where are those areas and how deep is the water? That's part of doing your homework. Another mistake that I see guys make a lot is you don't want to be kicking and trolling at the same time. What I mean by that is if I'm trolling like this, I'll put my fly out and I start trolling away. Don't strip and kick at the same time, because what you do is you end up moving your fly twice as fast, and that's not a good presentation. You think you're moving it slow, but actually you've doubled the speed if you're kicking and retrieving at the same time. So if you're going to troll, troll it. If you're going to retrieve it, stop, hold your position. You can't be moving. Make your cast, and then do the retrieve back the way you want to make it in the water, whatever depth you want to fish it. Another point, and this is not as important, but you guys remember the most productive area in any lake is always in shallow water. If you're on a shallow lake in general, you might find it just as productive out here in the middle as you do along the shoreline, and that's okay. But if you're going to do it, fish those feeding areas where trout come in to eat. Don't fish back in the deeper part, because those fish out there, they're going to be down deeper because they're not going to be feeding. They're resting out there. Your feeding fish are going to be right along that shoreline. So if you guys keep your fly in these zones, and you see a spot that you like, stay within casting distance of where you want it to be, make your cast, and slowly start stripping that fly back. If the fish are there and they see it and they're feeding, they're going to take your presentation. So that's the most important things that I find on a lake. If you're going to be more productive with the time that you spend on it, just try those pointers right there, and let's see if you aren't a little more lucky by the time that sun goes down at the end of the day. Folks, there's one more point I think I ought to bring up, and that's a lot of us that fish out of float tubes and pontoon boats, we're real low to the water, so you got to consider rod length when you're in that, because a lot of guys that aren't real good casters will flog the water in front of them and behind them, and that's not the way to get the distance that you want. What I find that I would recommend for you is to use at least a 9-foot rod. Even a 9.5 and 10 foot, if you can handle that, isn't a bad idea. But remember, when you're in a float tube, your line's going to be traveling very close to the water. So line speed becomes absolutely critical. And what I mean by that is when you're making your cast, make sure that you're stopping that rod here and here, and try to tighten your loop up and build line speed up. Line speed will allow you to get greater distances, and you won't be flogging that water. If you do it in front, all it means is that you're probably dropping your forward cast down too low. And what I mean by that is and the same thing occurs on our back cast. If I go back too far this way and allow the line to hit her, it could be a timing thing, I'm waiting too long. But you don't want that fly to be hitting the water, especially if that water's real flat without any ripple. Because without cover, all we're going to do is spook those fish. So one of the things I would suggest that you try to do, and you may have to practice this at home on the lawn or in a swimming pool or something like that, is bring that line back and forth really fast, build up that tension. But look how much I'm moving my rod. I'm hardly moving my hand at all, but yet the rod's doing all the work. And if I want to shoot a lot, I can shoot a lot of line on that back cast. You don't have to get all that line up in the air. What I'll do, and I know it's going to be kind of hard to see it because I'm using a clear line here, but I'm going to make a shot right up this way, and you can see how much line I'm going to shoot here with only a couple of false casts. There's probably about 50 feet laying here in front of me, so I'm going to put one good hard cast this way and then let it go. And when I hear that reel go zzz, then I know that I'm capable of throwing a lot more line, because I built up enough line speed to get that line to shoot out. I'm not sitting here false casting, and if that wind's blowing, just remember that's something you don't want to do either, because then you run higher risk of hitting yourself or having something go wrong. So just remember, when you're on the water, if you're in a float tube, build up line speed, try to get the best distance you can, and hold that rod up in a tighter arc so you're running a shallower loop, and you'll get more distance without disturbing the water. Since this whole video is really about what I do on lakes, keep in mind it's not the only way to fish it. There's a lot of ways to fish lakes, but the system that I use I find is very simple, it's easy to apply, and it works very, very consistently for me no matter where I go. And when it comes down to it, I basically use two lines. A clear intermediate to fish the top 6 feet, a type 2 clear line to fish the next 6 feet down. I have about 5 flies that I mentioned to you that I like to fish for the most part, but if I have to get into difficult situations, I may break out the streamers if I know that there's big fish out there. For the most part, the small flies I'll fish up, the bigger flies up or down, dragon nymphs, whatever it might be. But the retrieves that I'll use to match those flies, I'm going to hand twist most of the stuff, or I'm going to use a short pull and pause like this. The bigger flies, the seal buggers and leeches, longer pulls with definite drops. stops in them. If I find they want more of a jerky pull, then like when I'm in this tube, I can't do this and drop the line out in the water like I do when I'm in my other boat. So in a float tube like this, I'll put that tip down and just do shorter pulls, but the speed is critical. So keep that in mind. Whenever you're talking retrieve, what we're really talking about is presentation. And I find the best definition for presentation is your ability to make those fish eat. And there's times they're not going to want to eat, so you have to entice them. So if you use that system, you're able to cast and you know the places where to look for fish, and we all know that. Let's just talk about that real quick again. Look for your shallow shoreline areas. That's where I'm going to fish first. And if they're not in the shallows and the sun's high, they've moved out to deeper water, I'll look for old stream bed channels if it's a reservoir. I'll look for any kind of rock structure or log structure. I'll look for springs, inlets, drop-offs, all those places. But early and late in the day, the best feeding zone is going to be up. And it's going to usually be in shallow water. If the whole lake is shallow, it could be out in the middle and they'll be subsurface. And the other thing, remember, you got to have cover when you're fishing lakes. At least the big fish like to have cover when they're feeding. And cover, again, is when we have a lack of sunlight early and late in the day, when we've got a good ripple on the water, or algae. Anything that will give you cover from those fish. If you can't see them, they can't see you. But remember this, if you can see them, they probably saw you first. So think about presentation, be able to get that fly in there without spooking them, and pull those flies slow, fish them shallow, and I know you're going to do well. Now before I close, I want to make one more point, and I think this is of interest to all of us. With more and more people on the water today, there seems to be a growing lack of concern for our fellow fishermen. And that comes under the subject of etiquette. You guys, I know we all want to catch fish and we want to catch big fish, but there's no reason in the world, if you got some guy out there that's catching fish and he's very successful, give him his space. Don't crowd him, don't move over there because he's catching fish, because I'll tell you, what he's doing and why he's successful has to do with probably the pattern, the line, and the retrieve that he's using. Locations, there's lots of locations on a lake that'll hold fish. So you guys, if you know he's doing well, this is one of the reasons why I like to fish lakes, because of the solitude that affords in the big fish. And you guys, let's be considerate of the other guy, not to crowd him. If he's in fishing toward the shore, never pass between the shoreline and a guy who's fishing it. Always go around him, let him know you're there. Be courteous. If you see a guy struggling or you know he's struggling, I find it's always nice to go up and offer him something. Some of us don't like to say anything unless they ask for it, and you can do it either way. But if a guy asks you for help, don't turn him down. If he needs a fly because you know that you're doing well and you've had a great day, you'll feel even better if you pass that fly on to somebody else and let him be successful. So with that thought in mind, I wish you a lot of big fish, and I hope that this video will be a lot of help for you. Put any more pressure on it. I'm putting a lot. I haven't seen this thing yet. Now I got an idea why she's pulling so hard. That, look at the color on that big nail. Holy Toledo. That is a big fish. That is a big fish.